name's Adam Edwards. I'm a reader in politics and criminology at Cardiff University in the UK, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to be interviewing Tim Hope, formerly professor at Keele University, professor of criminology, now currently a visiting fellow at Centre for Crime and Justice Research in London. So Tim, to kick off, what do you think have been your two main contributions to European criminology?
The first one, I think, is reaching an understanding of the distribution, the social distribution of crime across people, places, and communities. And within that, an understanding of the importance and role of inequality, both related to the inequality of society and the inequality within crime victimization particularly as well. My second contribution is in reaching an understanding through the evaluation of programs and interventions of the complex relationships and conflicts of interest between evidence and policy.
And if we could commence with that first main contribution, and this is an interest which very much began way back in your first criminological post as such in the Home Office, having graduated from sociology degree at Leeds University in the UK.
Yes, I'd completed some postgraduate research at London School of Economics and was looking for employment in research in the mid-1970s. At that time, there had been, it was the end of the era of the expansion of funding in higher education, and academic posts were ceasing to be advertised and becoming rare. But the government was recruiting for social scientists. This was still an era of, from the 60s and 70s, of the application of science and rationality to government. The first phase, I think, of interest in evidence and its relationship to policy. There was a need to recruit social scientists across the range of policy departments. I was initially attracted to working in our housing ministry because I was interested as a sociologist in communities, but however I was asked whether I was interested in or applying for a post in the Home Office research unit in crime and justice. I'd had no experience of criminology or crime previous to that. I might have done, I think I did one or two lectures attended one or two lectures in crime and deviance. But as a sociologist at that time, with the quite radical revolution against positivism and against the issues of labelling, symbolic interactionism, and critical sociology were very much the approaches in which I was trained, and coinciding with the publication the year before of my recruitment of the new Criminology by Taylor, Morton and Young. And so I entered the Home Office with some trepidation and some rather mixed feelings. On the one hand, the need for employment and the opportunity to carry on and develop in social research, but also the feeling of working for the state, working for authority in a climate, in a still critical and radical climate in the social sciences. So I joined the Home Office really in very mixed mind and in trepidation, and wondering what part of repression I was going to be asked to help
But initially, to your surprise and pleasure, then the research program you got involved in was that of prevention.
Absolutely.
Rather than repression.
Crime prevention itself was an attractive idea, an important idea for me, because it was about, it wasn't correctionism, it wasn't the repression of the state, it was about reform. It reflected my sociological views about the causes of crime and about deprivation and about community. But I found myself working under a group, a team being led by Ron Clark, who was a senior member of the Home Office Research Unit, and very rapidly becoming interested, enthralled, convinced by an argument that had been developing in the Home Office Research Unit, and again, a response to the crisis of that time in corrections, the what would have subsequently been called the nothing works era. Martinson had just produced his review. A review of nothing works was being put together by, or the effectiveness of penal interventions was being put together by the Home Office Research Unit. And Ron Clark and colleagues, including Derek Cornish, who I shared an office with and spent quite a long time listening to and learning, had developed, or were developing, what's now become known as situational crime prevention. But very much as an argument, a conflict within psychology, and within almost an argument against clinical psychology. And situational crime prevention took ideas from psychology, primarily, from the social learning theory of Bandura, from elements of what we would now call behaviourism, or what was becoming known as behaviourism, ideas associated with B.F. Skinner and others. And we're fashioning that into a new and quite radical approach to crime prevention, which is subsequently called situational crime prevention. The idea that the actor is essentially a thinking, a reasoning criminal, not necessarily a rational actor in an economic sense, but a reasoning criminal who will weigh up the decision to commit a crime or not, on a balance of probabilities, if you like, between the opportunities presented by the circumstances and environment in which he or she finds themselves, and the risks of apprehension and detection or surveillance present in the environment. And that seemed to me new, innovative, challenging, practical, intriguing, and it seemed to be consistent with some of the work and my training within sociology, particularly the sociology of action and individual action and of interaction. So there were sufficient affinities to allow me to keep hold of some of my sociology while at the same time engaging in this work.
Yet subsequently, one of the many things you've become renowned for in your career has been, or latterly, as a critique of that programme of situational crime prevention. So what happened to begin to change your mind?
My other interest and contribution, working in the Home Office Research Unit, we were moved from projects which were proof of concept, if you like, tightly controlled associational studies, to a demonstration project to put the situational approach into action. And I was involved in a part of the team that were involved in implementing the process, in understanding the process and evaluating some of the impact of this. And this demonstration project, which was focused on preventing vandalism to schools, raised a very large number of examples of failure, of implementation failure, of practical failure, and all of which had a very understandable set of explanations. Of miscommunication, of failing to communicate the reason for doing something to people, and failing to organise things, of competing objectives that education officials and schools had, and so on and so forth. All the things that we associate with policy failure and policy implementation were present there. What those struck me very forcefully was that situational crime prevention, although it purported in theory to be a practical crime prevention approach, had absolutely no lexicon, had absolutely no means, no reflected means of understanding its own practicality. It had no theory of practicality.
And as you've said before and elsewhere, if there is an interest in situations causing crime, there ought to be in turn an interest in what causes the situations, and if you like, the context, the social context, the conditions in which those situations and opportunities arise.
Absolutely.
That became very much a sort of key interest of yours.
Indeed. And that's, in a sense, sociology coming back in, because from the point of view of the essentially psychological theory, the individualistic inside-out theory of situational crime prevention, of trying to model the offender's perceptions. The environment is just one encompassing thing around the individual. The individual is the focus, then the environment is simply that which surrounds that individual in the course of action. Which is all very well in terms of explaining action, but doesn't have any explanation about how you change that environment, how you would modify that environment. It's almost stepping outside of the test tube and setting up how you actually get a laboratory together in order to do the experiment. There was nothing in the theory that said anything about implementation, setting up the laboratory conditions to do the science, to do the study, to do the change. So, and that was to change environments was very much a social, political, economic, cultural process.
And these were some of the key themes that came out of the renowned edited volume that you put together with Margaret Shaw on communities and crime prevention.
Yes, it followed from my dissatisfaction with, for those reasons, with situational crime prevention, but also, and this is important to remember, that we were working in a research institute of the British government, the Home Office, and our primary obligation was to do work for policymakers, to inform policy and to evaluate policy. Looking back now, the era of the 1980s associated with governments of Margaret Thatcher and so on, tends to see situational crime prevention as, with its emphasis on individual rational choice and so on, as the echt policy of prevention for a neo-liberal government. And David Garland, for example, has argued this very strongly in The Culture of Control. That's a misreading of the policy at the time and a misreading of the interests of the Thatcher governments, because alongside this interest in the rational individual and rational choice, There was also the other strand of conservatism, if you like, an interest in informal social control, how we can control crime through civil society, as we might call it now, how we can create the good civil society without the need for interference from the state and from government. And the idea that crime is, and paradoxically, crime is therefore a social phenomenon in that it is a failure of citizens acting independently of government. It's a failure of citizens acting together to ensure their own conformity.
Now,
that was just as much of an interest for the government as situational crime prevention, and that led me to an interest in I suppose the distribution of crime, but the way in which inequality of crime was focusing and concentrating within what was then the very large public housing sector. We had the phenomenon of the social problem of the sink housing estate, the problem housing estate, the new slums, the new ghetto, the very slums that the post-war era of housing had meant to eradicate appeared to be replicating themselves very rapidly within the social housing sector. Our equivalent of the banlieue around Paris.
And to pick up on
yes.
that French reference there, also interestingly at this time you were somewhat of the Home Office's emissary to a rival form of
yes.
crime prevention that had been developing on the continent under the auspices of the French mayor and policy entrepreneur, reformer, Gilbert Bonmaison,
oui.
who in the early 1980s had come out with a vision of social crime prevention which has often been starkly contrasted with that
yes.
advocated by the Home Office during the period of the Thatcher administrations in the 70s.
Very much so, yes. And we delivered within the Home Office Research Unit, myself and a number of colleagues, under the leadership of the outstanding leadership of our then director, Mary Tugg, who worked very closely with ministers and had a very close and trust relationship with one of Margaret Thatcher's longest-serving Home Secretaries, Douglas Hurd, to push this connection, to see the European approach to urban safety, which evolved into the European Forum for Urban Safety and the International Centre for the Prevention of Crime that Irving Waller had initiated to form links with Canada, to very much keep this social democratic, community focused, participatory focus alive. And we established links then, and then I have continued throughout my career to work in this field and to work closely with the European Forum for Urban Safety. So initially it started out as an antithesis to the Thatcher neoliberalism, and then has become part of my work, central importance of my work, and my connection with European interests. Latterly, in my academic career, I continued that work and those connections with colleagues in the Città Sicure project in Emilia-Romagna, with Paverini and Dario Malossi and Rossella Selby.
So really this connection with the European Forum for Urban Security, or Maison philosophy, if you like, was really the start of a keener interest in social and economic policy responses to crime. And
it was an opportunity. I had always wanted and been keen to develop and to articulate those links of social crime prevention and of the connection between social policy and crime policy. The French urban model provided that opportunity, but it also provided the opportunity for us in the Home Office to work closely with our colleagues in our housing and communities department of central government, who were, and throughout this long period from the mid-70s onwards, had been responsible for fostering and nourishing an approach from the non-government, the NGO sector, to community organising against crime. Bodies in the United Kingdom, NACRO, the National Association for Care and Resettlement of Offenders, were running participatory projects in some of these worst estates, or problem estates, to reduce initially vandalism and the onset of crime in communities. And there was a lot of intellectual, criminological interest too in that, which I was keen to align myself to in the work within the unit. Particularly work led by Tony Bottoms, Professor Bottoms, on the urban criminal and the Sheffield urban crime study, and particularly charting community crime careers and the concept
of housing markets
and the effect of particularly of housing markets and of social housing markets too. So that although not orthodox within the Home Office, formed a considerable link. The issue. So the Home Office itself, the Home Office had a bifurcated approach to crime prevention. On the one hand, it had allocated situational crime prevention to its police department. And another important agenda for the Home Office, which arguably continues to this day, is the question of not what should we do about crime, but what should we do about the police. Here you have an institution, the police, who are ostensibly there to control crime, whose raison d'etre is to control crime, and yet on all the evidence they fail to do so, and to my way of thinking, continue to fail to do so, and perhaps always will continue to do so. And yet, an institution that carried enormous, then anyway, carried enormous public support, and yet to a conservative government interested in rolling back the state and cutting public expenditure, an anathema in terms of using enormous amounts of public expenditure. So the main policy question became not for the Home Office, not how to prevent crime, but how to get the police to prevent crime effectively. And so situational crime prevention became increasingly a technology for policing, an application, a technique of policing, and differed from the initial formulation that Ron Clark and others had, which presupposed a governance approach, a technology of government, or a multi-agency approach. Here it became a technology for the police, and a technology that the police were to apply in a multi-agency setting, were to actually bring everybody on side in order to apply situationally informed approaches. And of course, I and other interested in the Home Office were opposed to that approach, and increasingly became conflictual. And in those days, within central government, different civil servants representing different interests and different policy interests within government would rather like an Oxbridge debating chamber, would fight out these differences around committees and would have arguments across the dividing lines. So I would frequently find myself in my latter time at the Home Office with from the Home Office Research Unit on the one side with Mary Tuck and colleagues, across the table from the Police Department and colleagues such as Gloria Laycock and Kevin Heal and others, representing the police view of situational crime prevention. And the edited volume to which you referred a bit earlier, that I edited with my colleague Margaret Shaw, was part of that, which was a collection of papers, was part of that battle, part of that argument, part of a way of sustaining and articulating this other crime prevention approach, this social community crime prevention approach.
And in order to pursue that research agenda, though, you elected to back into the academy, first of all with a brief sojourn in the United States,
yes,
coming back to the University of Manchester's
yes,
Quantitative Criminology group.
Yes. Well, there were two reasons for that, as always. With people, there's your own personal development and trajectory, and then there's the political employment context in which you were working. I had, by that time I'd completed a PhD by part-time study, and I had not, if anything, my yearning to become an independent academic was becoming stronger. At the same time as our efforts to offset the remorseless march of situational crime prevention and the police technology that went with it was becoming harder to sustain and harder to get a fair crack of the whip. I directed a very large research project to evaluate a social housing community intervention. It's called the Priority Estates Project. At the time I was doing that, and the Home Office, the Police Department, the Home Office, the Crime Prevention Unit, initiated their own prevention program in competition to prove a different theory,
Centering on the
ECOH. And that was called the ECOH project. They were both projects focused on the same kinds of estate, but focused on entirely different social processes. One, community informal control participation, which inevitably produced mixed results. And I published a paper with my colleague Janet Foster called conflicting forces. What I meant at the time was conflicting forces between safety and crime, between the criminogenic and the and there we have a problem, because we need to frame an adequate counterfactual to crime, which isn't just non-crime. Conflicting forces between safety, urban security, community safety, and crime. And inevitably, we found mixed results. And particularly looking back, that study, we happened to have conducted that study at the time in which the concentration of poverty in social housing was becoming extreme. And when I was in America, where I went to work as an academic, have an academic position, the narrative and struck most resonances for the processes we were seeing happening in our study was William Julius Wilson's
Truly disadvantaged.
thesis of the truly disadvantaged, of concentrated disadvantage. And those shorn of perhaps race, those similar processes of the concentration of what Wilson called social dislocation alongside the concentration of poverty. And that, so returning from America to take up a post in Manchester, that was very much on my mind.
And at this time, of course, several sweeps of the British Crime
Yes.
Survey were now available.
Yes.
Yes. As was the technology to hypothecate that, link that data
Yes.
with census
Yes.
data
Yes.
and other indices of multiple
Absolutely so.
population.
Yes.
And this was a really, for me, certainly, key contribution you've made. That work with Alan Trickett, Ken Pease, that period. So
Let me just say a bit about that. I'd started doing that at the Home Office as part of the interest in public housing and crime, and I'd managed with British Crime Survey, as it was then called, data, to replicate the inequality between estates in the housing estates, value within the of an economic inequality and to correlate with crime rate. So the poorest of the social housing estates had the highest concentrated crime rates. So when I returned, that was foremost in my mind, to start to think and research thoroughly the issue of the distribution of crime.
And one of the key things that came out of that then was this Lorenz curve distribution, in which, if I understand it correctly, it came from looking at extreme inequalities in the distribution of household income in the developing world. Actually, Lorenz had discovered likes of Rio and such like, where the top 10 decile, top 20%, nonetheless acquire the overwhelming majority of the wealth. And that idea then was something that occurred to you that might explain this extremely unequal distribution of criminal victimisation.
Very much so.
What became the 80-20.
Yes, yes. I mean that stood out like that. I mean that crime victimisation was more unequal than the distribution of income and wealth, and I thought, well, it ought to be obvious that there is a relationship. They both have the same distribution,
and
the same inequality
for both personal and property crime.
Yes, yes. That inequality in victimisation, inequality in crime victimisation, was thoroughly correlated with social economic inequality. Initially at the community level, and so my agenda from that point really was to elaborate and substantiate that. But again, this kind of constructive or whatever rivalry with this other strand emerging out of psychology, this situational crime prevention that I was talking about, that reproduced itself because the distribution of crime being highly unequal, 80-20.
So specifically,
yes.
80% of the residential population is estimated from the analysis of this data.
At most 20% of the crime.
Whereas 20% of the population, 80% for
crime.
personal property crime.
Now the idea coming out of the Kirkhope Prevention Project and associated particularly with Ken Pease, with whom I initially collaborated on these issues with Alan. The idea was that high crime areas, like they had published a very seminal paper in important paper, I think, called What is Different About High Crime Areas. What was different about high crime areas is that they had a very large number of concentration of repeat victims, and so the idea, but this is one of those questions in science and logic, which is, is the pot half full or half empty? For Ken Pease and colleagues, interested in developing situational prevention and a technique for policing, would say that the concentration of crime, the inequality of crime, was due to the concentration of repeat victims. And that crime, and tied to their idea that repetitive victimization happened fairly frequently after each other in a very rapid boosting process, would mean that conveniently crime was effectively its own cause, and if you wanted to prevent future crime you needed to work on, forestall this otherwise boosted process.
And that analysis, rival thesis, if you like, of contagion,
yes.
Very much rooted, if you like, one might even say an artefact of the frequentist statistical modelling that came out of that work in the Manchester
yes.
Institute Group.
I mean, that's
against which
yes.
then you began to develop Bayesian probabilities approach,
yes,
which
very
was
much so.
as interested then in the 80% of non-victims, or the 80% only suffering at best a fifth of personal property crime, as being as central to the analysis of the distribution of victimisation as simply focusing on those who were actually victimised, and chronically so.
Yes.
And it was the analytical shift then away from the chronically, multiply victimised towards the non-victimised.
Yeah.
What was it about these non-victims that made them non-victims?
Yes.
Which really, led to you developing your immunisation thesis.
Yes.
Because you could tell us a bit more about that.
Well, we first asked the question, are repeat victims different? Now, victims are different from non-victims. They might be poorer, they might be living in these areas and so on. They have different social, they might be younger or whatever. But repeat victims are not different from victims generally. There is nothing that is a priori predictive of repeat victimization. And in parenthesis, there's nothing a priori, I suspect, in hotspots. And actually, there's nothing a priori that is predictive of predictive policing other than some process.
So from that point
yes,
of view then you
so that was the starting point.
Conceptualised
I knew it
non-victimisation.
intuitively at first. I knew that it wasn't... The repeat victims were neither predisposed to be victims, nor, and I was suspicious also of the alternative explanation, that they must therefore be have some contagion.
Mm-hmm. So rather it was about the gross and unequal distribution of immunity to crime.
Exactly.
And that really shifts the whole
Yes.
analytical and indeed
Yes.
policy debate about the
Yes.
distribution
Yes.
of crime victimisation
Because-
towards more social and economic
Yes,
factors.
because, and this is, I think, the conclusion I've sort of come to now, at the end of what I suppose, starting work with Alan Trickett and moving on with other collaborators to the present, is really reconfiguring this 80-20 distribution. First of all, and this connects to my abiding interest in communities and normality, and just social control, in a sense, is we have no proper counterfactual to crime. If crime, victimization or offending even, if it is a deviation, there is no conception, at least in positivistic criminology, as to, or no articulation as to what this deviation is deviating from. So I have reached now, I think, a positive distribution, a positive definition of non-victimization, which I posit now that the distribution of crime, this unequal distribution of crime, is due to the mixing, as it were, of two probability functions. At any one time, any person, any actor, let's say, any community or any unit has a position on two probability distributions. One, the likelihood that they'll become a victim, and the other, the likelihood that they'll become a non-victim, or become a zero, or be a zero. Mm-hmm. And conceptually, and if one therefore converts this unequal distribution into the mixing, the meeting of these two propensities, one for safety, if you like, or one for immunity, and one for exposure, because there's a very large element of chance. There are far fewer crimes than there are opportunities for crime. There are far fewer events than could be explained by over-deterministic, positivistic type explanations of any kind. So we need to account for the social structuring of these probabilities.
And in that regard, you've spoken of people's access to private or club goods.
Yes.
There's a central dynamic in explaining that.
Yes. Yes.
Or even distribution of immunity to crime.
Absolutely.
So say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Well, that came out of work that I continue to do in terms of modelling participation in Neighbourhood Watch, which was a policy that the government wished to pursue. And my explanation of Neighbourhood Watch was that, or rather, to explain the high rates of non-crime in affluent areas rather than the high rates of crime in poor areas. And I used the notion of club goods, which I borrowed from public sector economics, in order to conceptualize what it is that residents in a safe, affluent neighbourhood provided. Which is not to say that is a gated community is one where is a mini state, if you like, where residents cede responsibility to the owners, to the proprietors. An exclusive suburb is one that defines itself, that excludes others, primarily through the housing market, but through the process of economic inequality, selects a club, a safe club, which then provides, through its insulation from offenders, its mutual social capital, a set of guarantees of club goods, which are experienced as public goods rather than private goods of fortifying their own.
The final aspect of that key contribution then is that private club good then also has an impact back upon the vulnerable, the 20% experience, the 80%, because particularly in times of austerity or reduced immunity from the state, if you like, the inability to afford your own club goods renders you even more vulnerable to predation.
Yes.
So that becomes a way of explaining the concentration upon concentration.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, what may be the dynamic behind crime, the growth of crime or the drop in crime, is not the concentration of crime or criminals or vulnerable victims. It's the, per se, it's the hugely important social selection that allows those with economic capital to convert that into safety, to exclude others into the uncontrolled, unsupervised, unprotected. So the poor find themselves living together. They're communities of fate, whereas the clubbing of private security is part of the community of choice. But only those with sufficient economic capital, and which then, of course, generates more by way of social capital.
And this, connected back to your initial preoccupations in the Home Office, is not a policing problem. It is a social and economic problem.
It is a social and economic problem.
And then just to bring things right up to date, then in your current work on the Matrix projects, so it is just as if you like the sweeps of the British Crime Survey and the ability to link that to census data on multiple indices of deprivation enabled that sort of breakthrough, the 80-20 immunisation thesis.
Yeah.
How has the advent of so-called big data, the digitalisation of large administrative data sets, covering this breadth of social and economic indices, as well as police recorded crime, as well as user-generated data from social media and the like, how has that begun to further enhance or develop your thinking about immunisation?
Well, that ambition, that idea of with big data is an encapsulating holistic model of society is some way off. But what I have been working on, and bearing in mind that I need a technique that would allow the modelling of the prediction of zeros, as well as the prediction of positive values. And of course, positivistic methodology discounts zeros. A probabilistic approach of the data mining approach that underlies big data technology, the development of probabilistic methods, including classification, allows one to look at the probability of non-victimization, of immunity, separate from the probability of victimization. They may have, well, in fact, and my research is beginning to suggest this. What affects your chances of not being a victim, of being safe, are not the same things that affect your chances of being a victim. They're different.
Okay.
And that brings us, that kind of almost opens the whole box of criminology again, because it means that we must stop focusing on one tail of the distribution, our particular problem. Just because we are criminologists, we must only look at crime. We need to look at society and crime.
And by way of a conclusion then, and to pick up the other second key contribution on evaluation of programmes, it is remaining focused on those two tails then, which led you to argue against some other favoured evaluation approaches.
Yes.
In contemporary criminology, the randomised controlled trial,
the
scientific realist approach, and some of the arguments that you had with advocates of those, again back in the Home Office, but this time as an academic involved in the Home Office crime reduction program.
That was a sorry tale, really, but indicative. I, along with many other academics, were brigaded to evaluate the government's crime reduction program, a massive investment, but one which had tended in the end to be dominated and influenced by this situational policing approach, situational opportunity reduction approach, which was the orthodoxy still. And essentially, to cut a long story short, we found that not only, we found some successes, but we found some failures. But we found that the projects that failed the most were the ones that were run, that were directed by the police, and the ones that were particularly focusing on the prevention of repeat victimization and very, very much police-driven approaches to prevention. Whereas the ones that succeeded, and there were fewer, but we thought our methods were quite reliable to show that, were the ones that were very adaptive, used a whole range of measures, had participation with the community, importantly, changed their plans as they went along. Rather than stick to try and prove a theory or a particular approach, changed their plans, stopped targeting repeat victims because they couldn't find any, and so on. And so we reported that, or we wished to report that. But unfortunately, that ran against the orthodoxy of those responsible for running this program and claiming success for it. And that led to a very long and bitter set of arguments about evidence and about publication and about...
and somewhat of a rupture between the Academy and the Home Office, again.
Well, I can't speak for the Academy as a whole, but certainly a final rupture between myself and my origins. So after this long journey of starting perhaps in the opposite way to which most scientists and academics start, which is starting in science and in the academy and then wanting to shape and influence policy and have some impact. I think I've moved as a result of this experience and of chance from within to outside. So paradoxically, I feel I've become more critical
and now,
as I've got older.
Final statement as an independent researcher now. Where do you see your work going? Because we talked a lot about your legacy, but I mean, you still contributing, still researching. And what are your plans for the future then?
I really now believe that I have a very strong statistically based theory to support this theory of immunisation and contagion, of immunity and exposure. I think it's a very powerful general model. I've recently been applying that to violence, interpersonal violence against men and against women. And I think paradoxically, the only offence, but importantly, the only offence where this process of contagion is effective is, or seems to be at work, is domestic violence. For all other crimes, and particularly for property crimes, it's safety, the clubbing of private security. So I think that's getting somewhere now towards a more general theory of crime victimisation.
And the social and economic policy
and the
response.
social and economic policy response to that. So the next few years are going to be
on that. Fantastic.
Putting that together.
Well, Tim, we look forward very much to hearing more on that theme. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.